Hello, I'm Rob Forsyth. Welcome to Liberalism in Question. In this half-hour podcast series from the Centre for Independent Studies, we explore questions and challenges to liberalism today. My guest today is Chandran Kukathas, who is the Lee Kong Chang Chair in Political Science and the Dean of Social Sciences at Singapore Management University. Chandran is an Australian, but he's also worked in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and here in Australia. Chandran, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Rob. Nice to be here.
Have you always been a supporter of liberalism?
I think yes. Of course, it's not easy to account for when I first came to these views, and certainly for a long time, certainly when I was in high school, I didn't really know the term. And for a while, I thought I would like to become a Marxist. Even in my early days at university, I think I thought I would end up being a Marxist historian of one sort or another. But looking back, I can see that all of my intellectual and philosophical commitments and orientations were essentially liberal. I just didn't know the terminology. I thought that I might have been a Marxist because the theory sounded cool. And some of the commitments of it to human equality and the prosperity and future of the world looked like they were compelling ideas that I needed to get to know. But as I studied, I think I discovered that I was really a liberal.
Can you say what it was about Marxism as you got closer to it that you realised that although it was promising good things, it was not the way forward?
Well, it really happened in my last year at university. I was primarily a history major. I ended up doing combined honours in history and political science. And I planned to go on to write history, but basically fell in love with political theory in that last year. When I studied political theory that year, we took a course in political science methodology, and I was introduced to the ideas of Karl Popper, who was, at least in some parts of his work, a critic of Marxism, primarily on methodological foundations. My history class was run by a couple of professors who were very sympathetic to Marx and Marxism as a way of studying history. I wouldn't say they were Marxists themselves necessarily, but I was one of the few people in the class who knew Marx and Marxism quite well, having read a lot in political theory in the political science department. But after I read Popper, I started to become much more critical of it as a doctrine for methodological purposes. I suddenly started seeing the idea of a philosophy of history as just implausible, or the idea that there were philosophical trends or historical developments that could be predicted is simply...
You're thinking perhaps of...
I concluded it was a kind of functional explanation that didn't work. And that more or less killed off my budding Marxism.
I'm a great fan of Popper as well, actually, and I think his Poverty Historicism and the Open Society and its enemies.
Those are the two works that shaped my...
I thought so.
I wouldn't say it was a conversion because there was nothing much there to convert in the first place. But in those days, I was a staunch advocate of the Australian Labor Party. I was there on the steps of Parliament House in 1975 when the Prime Minister stepped up and referred to the Governor General as someone who needed, saving, and referred to the Prime Minister as Kerr's Kerr. And I was outraged, and I think then I saw myself pretty much as a good socialist, but without knowing any of the theory. But all that changed over the next couple of years.
There is a saying, as I attributed to George Bernard Shaw, that if you're not a socialist as a young person, you have no heart. If you are as an older person, you have no head. I'm sure you seem to have lived that, actually. Yes,
I think so. I mean, I'm less critical of socialism in many respects than, say, I might have been in my middle-aged years, now that I'm in my 60s. I mean, I'm still pretty critical of it, but I don't think I've ever been really critical of the motivation of socialists. I think I still share that motivation. You want the world to be a better place. You want human beings to live better. You want them to be free. And Marx, after all, was ultimately concerned mostly about human freedom. And I think that's what liberalism is about, essentially. It's about human freedom. The emphases are different and the analysis is different, but that's really what it's concerned with above all.
Yes. I think you're making a good point here, that those who want to defend liberalism are doing so because they believe it is the better way for humans to flourish, not simply as a principle in itself. And in that, they can share at least that part with others with whom they may completely disagree about the means as well, I guess.
Yes. Well, the person who probably had most influence on me in this regard, F.A. Hayek, you may recall, dedicated his book, The Road to Serfdom, to the socialists of all parties. And essentially, he thought, certainly at that time, that there was no difference among liberals and socialists when it came to the objectives. The differences were differences of method, if you like. I don't think that's quite right. I think there are also substantial differences of moral emphasis.
And anthropology too. I think there's something in this series we've noticed that many have said that one of the essence of liberalism, it's not utopian in the way in which some other movements are, and therefore, in a sense, more patient and less liable to invoke, not always, of course, but less liable to invoke violence and terror to achieve the liberation of human beings.
Yeah, I think that's true. But again, with respect to socialists, for example, it does depend very much on which socialists you're talking about, because the socialist tradition is itself, like the liberal one, quite a broad one. And you can think about those who essentially want to see the end of capitalism, and those who say model their thinking on the Scandinavian countries, where there are very, very free markets, but quite extensive forms of government regulation and, more importantly, wealth transfer. And they might see those countries as socialist, even though I think for someone like Marx, Sweden and Denmark are anything but socialist nations.
Yes, it's a word that suffers a kind of inflation of meaning, I suspect. My guest is Chandran Kukathas from Singapore. Chandran, what do you take to be the essence or the heart of liberalism?
Well, as I indicated before, I think it's a commitment to individual freedom. That's very important. But it's also equal freedom, because unless people are all free, then what you're talking about is something quite different. You may have a world, for example, in which only a certain race is free, or a society in which only the ruling class is free and everybody else labors, whether at worst as a slave or at best as someone subordinate. Well, I think liberalism is interested in freedom for everyone. So in that sense, it's an egalitarian doctrine. It's not egalitarian in every respect, and there are many arguments to be had there, but liberalism is essentially, I think, an argument or a position that upholds individual freedom. The other way to think about it is to say that liberalism, I think, arises out of a skepticism about power. And I think there are three sources of power that liberalism has attacked from the beginning. One is the power of the aristocracy, if you're going back to the 18th century, 19th century. The other is the power of the church. And the third, I think somewhat neglected nowadays, but very important, is the power of the mercantile class, the rising business class. And all of these elements of society exercise or wield power in order to gain advantage to themselves, whether for reasons of, say, financial interest, as in the case of the mercantile class, or for reasons of dogma, as in the case of some religious actors, or in the case of the aristocracy, for reasons of class interest. I think liberalism is characterized by a skepticism about all forms of power. And I think that's why liberals, unlike socialists, are wary of the idea of trying to address privilege and power by creating a greater power to rule over them. And that's why I think liberals are ultimately very skeptical about the state.
I want to come back to those three because I suspect in different forms, those three still exist today as threats to human liberty. Before I ask that question, can I go to the more sort of fundamental one? What led you to believe that it was this kind of approach to individual human freedom that is best for human flourishing?
Well, I didn't have a fully formed theoretical understanding till quite late on in my career. And I suspect that unless you actually devote yourself to this task, you wouldn't. So I guess your question is really about what were the kinds of instincts I had. And I think those instincts were essentially a kind of wariness of the whole idea of telling people what to do. I've just never liked that idea, whether others telling me what to do or the idea of my telling others what to do. It's always seemed to me that people should be left to live their own lives in the way they see fit. Now, of course, one of the difficulties here is that we inevitably find that some things that other people do are not just not for us, as it were, but also things that we might find distasteful or even repugnant or ultimately even morally wrong. And then the problem is, what do you do about those cases? To what extent do you then use power to enforce a particular view about what is right? And my instinct was always that, well, that's not really a very good thing to try to do, because what if others think that they're in the right? And simply asserting that you've got the right view seemed like a very, very unsatisfactory way of proceeding, in which case the only way to go, it seemed to me as a practical matter, is to talk it out. So I've never been persuaded by those who've got great moral theories that tell us what's right. I think they may be coherent, but they don't necessarily square with the way that other people think about the world. And so my attitude gradually became more and more to be one that emphasized the importance of toleration and dialogue, rather than trying to figure out what's the right thing and then imposing it.
Because you're fundamentally skeptical about there can be any agreement on what the right thing is, or even finding out what the right thing is. Is that your thinking?
I think both things are very difficult. And certainly finding agreement is very difficult, because it's difficult even to find the premises on which one would agree. So I think most theories that give you a pretty clear account of what the conclusions are have started off with premises that the advocates accept, but everybody else finds either mistaken or quite simply just question begging. You prove that if P and Q, then S, but you've already asserted that P is true, and anybody who doesn't accept that is never going to accept the conclusion, even if they accept the logic.
One thing I've noticed about your thinking, and this is in the liberal archipelago, that you say, and I quote here, you say, the human condition is one of conflicts. There is nothing in history that suggests that it's ever been otherwise. There's no plausible social theory that explains how it might ever be different in the future. So you see human beings, conflict as an essential element of the human condition.
I do. And I think there are multiple reasons for this. One is that, quite simply, we all have different personalities, and there are certain personalities in the world, and we've all come across people like this, for whom impatience and aggression is a part of the way they are. It doesn't necessarily even mean that they're bad people, but there we have it. There are others who are also more likely to be timid. There are people who are easily swayed. So we've got multiple personalities, and we've also got different interests and an inclination to see, the way we interpret the world and the things that are in our interests as somehow congruent. I don't see that as something that's very likely to change. We're very likely to see that what's good for us is good for everyone. Sometimes we may think that's not true, and we just are honestly going to say, well, I know this is bad for you, but this is what I want. But, given that we often have to give people better reasons than that, I think there's something in our nature that, tries to find a way of telling everybody else that this is going to be good for me, but it's going to be even better for you.
I think almost every tyranny has said it's for your good every single time.
Yes. But I think every older brother has said it to a younger brother as well.
I ask where are you in the birth order in your family?
I'm the oldest.
Good. We have a lot of burden.
4 younger sisters.
We carry a long burden, we older children, don't we?
We do.
I'm Rob Forsyth. This is Liberalism in Question. My guest today is Chandran Kukathas. You believe that freedom should be equal. People should be equally free, not for equal. One of the biggest arguments that's given for a strong state or state involvement, government involvement, is to help people to be equally free because power is not equal. How do you respond to that critique of a small government idea?
So I think there's a lot to that concern. I mean, we are not equal, and if we look at the social world, we'll find all kinds of inequalities of power. Some of them derive from differences in our natural ability. Some of them derive from our good fortune, perhaps in where we're born. Some of it derives from the ability of some people to game the system, take advantage of the rules to their own advantage. And ultimately, there are people, both individually and in concert with others, say as corporations or other institutions, who are able to change the rules to their advantage. And over time, I think there is a tendency for inequality also to manifest itself. On the other hand, there are also forces that work against inequality, because when one course of action looks like it's productive or advantageous, the tendency is for everyone to jump on that wagon, do the same thing, produce the same goods that others want, and so on. But at that point, the problem is that those who've got the starting advantage have a very, very strong interest in keeping people out, stopping them from joining in, stopping them from coming to get a share of the pie, so to speak. And you just think about corporations. They spend a lot of their money making better products and a lot of their money trying to stop other people entering the market. That's just the way of the world. That's okay. So one reason why I think a lot of people think that what we need, therefore, is some authority to step in to sort all this out and equalize is perfectly understandable. The problem is that it's not clear how we deal with the fact that all of those people who are taking advantage of the way things are going to be equally adept, if not more adept, because they've got more resources, at using this additional power to their advantage. I don't see any reason why, let's say, the state won't be captured by these people who will then use it to their advantage. Now, this is not to say that, okay, what we've got to do now is just get rid of the state. We can't get rid of it any more than we can get rid of the weather. It's there. So the question for me then is, to what extent should we put our trust in this institution? And to what extent should we try to initiate reforms that break down and spread political power and economic power? And that's the way that I tend to look at the world. So I'm very wary of any proposal that says, okay, what we'll do is give one kind of source of power greater authority, greater power to fix things in a way that's going to advantage everyone, which is not to say that every government is simply nakedly self-interested and nothing but. There are great differences among governments across the world. And to the extent that there's any policy that's being pursued, I would say, let's look at it. Let's look at how it affects the worst off in society, and push for those that are going to benefit the worst off in the long run. But as I say, I'm generally skeptical about this as a general strategy. It's a case of doing the best with what we've got, but not doing it in such a way that's going to increase the amount of power that's concentrated.
I can see that, Chandran, that you're trying very hard not to be ideological, as it were, in these matters.
It's not so much that I'm trying not to be ideological. It's more that, I don't want to turn around and say, well, look, liberalism is not an ideology. I don't think that gets you anywhere. If someone sees it as such,
no,
then that's the end of it. But what I don't want to suggest is that we should start our thinking by saying, okay, this is the label I operate under. These are the fixed convictions that are under that label, and we're going to derive every bit of analysis we have from that ideological position and repudiate or reject everything that comes from another ideological view. If you present me with something else that's, an ideology and say these are its arguments and conclusions, I would rather just question or, and analyze them in their own terms rather than just say, well, that's just socialism, so I'm not going to think about it.
Because it could be argued, thinking of the three sources of central power which liberalism critiques, as it were, crown and aristocracy, ecclesiastical authority, and the mercantile authority. And it's often been through the forcing of conditions and so forth upon the rampant capitalism of the 19th century that helped create much greater human flourishing. Do you think that was all justified? The notion of the state having to make sure there is genuine competition and to try and break the mercantile class, which tends to, well, as you said, aggregate more and more power to itself.
I think that would be too quick an analysis,
right?
Simply because I think the results have been mixed. On the one hand, states have broken up some forms of, let's say, of monopoly, but not always to everyone's advantage, because if there are natural monopolies, that's not necessary to everyone's advantage. Sometimes they've broken up some powerful corporations, but really because they were goaded into it by other powerful corporations. So, when you look at the fallout, you have to ask, well, has this been in the end to the advantage of everyone, or has it been disproportionately to the advantage of some other, corporate institutions? So, to give you a kind of practical example in the area of immigration reform. In the United States, for example, in the 1990s, under the Clinton administration, there were a number of steps taken to make sure that certain corporations were not hiring cheap labor and making profits off them. And in the end, a lot of those immigrant workers were deported because they were found to be working illegally and so on. But the imperative for this came from a number of other corporations who discovered that those companies were actually doing better than they were. And they themselves wanted immigrant labor, but they didn't want this company to have immigrant labor. So this was a way of getting rid of some of the competition. And then what they did was they petitioned Congress for a guest worker program so they could import their immigrant labor. So yes, on the one hand, the government took apart a certain element of corporate power, but really what was behind it was another side of corporate power. So I think one always has to look at different aspects of the.
Be suspicious of alternatives. If I just shift the focus just a little, you've worked in United States, Kingdom here. You've seen a very wide range of different societies. I would ask: is liberalism will vary very much depending upon the cultural context in which it lives? You want to comment on that in your own experience, perhaps?
It does, and I think it's partly because the liberal way of institutionalizing politics is something I think that has spread right around the world. So you'll find it in places like Malaysia and Singapore, as well as in Australia and Great Britain and the United States. And I think this is because of the way essentially European ideas have spread around the world through a number of forces, some of them colonialism, some of them religion, because I think liberalism is something essentially that has its origins in Christianity. So you'll find liberal elements all around the world because the world, in a sense, has evolved in a way that liberal political institutions are dominant. Think about the United Nations, the Declaration of Human Rights, the various treaties and conventions that you'll find around the world. They're all written essentially in a liberal language. They all emphasize the importance of the claims of the individual. They all emphasize the importance of containing power. They all emphasize equality and so on. These are all liberal ideas. It's not that you won't find any hints of these in India or China or other parts of the world, but the formulation is Western, it's European, it's Christian. So in any country that has some of that heritage, you'll find a certain measure of liberalism. Even in Singapore, where in a sense liberalism is explicitly disavowed as a matter of public philosophy. They see themselves as more communitarian, if you like. But that liberal element is there. So it varies across the world, I think, both because there are differences of political culture, there are differences of religion and communal ethic. And there are differences of attitude to certain simple things like the relationships you have with parents or with authority or with those who have responsibility for you. If you think about Australia, at the end of every first class, my students, when I taught at the Defence Force Academy, would walk up to me and say, "G'day, mate. Got a couple of questions for you." That would never happen in Singapore, nor would ever happen in the United States, but for different reasons. The culture and informality in Australia is very different. I don't want to make too much of it, but it spreads out into the rest of people's thinking. There is a kind of easier equality among people in Australia than there is in most places.
Yes.
There's much more formality in the United States, for example. On the other hand, in the United States, you have a liberalism that's also born out of a long history of struggle against slavery. And so the way in which people assert their rights is very different. And then you add to that the mix religion. People have a very different idea about where these rights come from than they do in Australia. Australia is much more utilitarian.
Given what you've said, it's clear that liberalism is not the natural state of humans. We don't have an innate desire for freedom. And if only we could remove all those other bad philosophies aside, the natural liberalism would emerge. That's a caricature, but I've sometimes heard that suggested. Even I think when certain wars are fought on the grounds to give people the freedom that they only could, only remove these bad people, they would spring up naturally liberals. This is plainly a completely false idea of human beings.
I think so. To the extent that you're simply looking at even just individuals, what their natural instincts are can never be gauged because we all come into the world as children. We grow up to more or less of an extent in a family or an extended family. All the instincts and intuitions we have are shaped by that. And then we're born into a context in which we are regularly told what to do, in which case, one of the things we're used to is being told what to do and telling others what to do. Now, I think that said, I suspect there is a kind of general instinct not to be confined, not to be pushed around, not to be the victim of violence. So there is something in us that naturally pushes against that. We have a capacity for resentment, but that's not enough on its own to generate liberalism. It could just as easily generate, strong norms of social and political authority
and terror, and the terror. If you're right, liberalism has its competitors today in the world. I can think of at least two, maybe probably many more actually. And in some countries like the People's Republic of China are explicitly saying they have another model. And I doubt whether certain religious countries, strongly with strong religious forces, thinking of Islamic countries, perhaps some Buddhist countries, would not in any sense regard liberalism as a viable option for them. In other words, liberalism is and remains contested in the world. Yes. Have you any thoughts about whether you think it has a future?
I think all I can say is that I hope it does. The reason I wouldn't say more is that the history of the world is not a history of the triumphal march of liberalism, which is, after all, a relatively recent phenomenon. Yes. More often than not, what we've seen in human history is powerful political authorities, leaders, or elites managing things to their own advantage. And the population at large is to, more or less of a degree, the source of the rents that they can extract. So I hope that this isn't all of our future, but I can't help but imagine that there will always be a certain element of this. At the same time, though, I think there are in all of the traditions you've mentioned elements, both practically and philosophically, that push against this. So you mentioned China, for example. I mean, the existing government of China is very strongly anti-liberal. I don't know that that's the attitude of the population, except to the extent that they've been fed a story about the dangers of not having strong, purposeful, elite rule. But there is in the Chinese tradition both, the authoritarian version of Confucianism, but also the Taoist tradition, which is much more skeptical about authority, much more skeptical about not just political authority, but of all kinds of confining institutions. I would hope that those sorts of attitudes, which have that imagine freer ways of being, will somehow come to the fore, particularly as people get more prosperous and so on. Similarly, in Islam, I mean, we've got very authoritarian forms of the doctrine, but we've also got the Sufi tradition, which is much more mystical, much less authoritarian, which sees the world, very differently, and of course has been subject to violent and critical attack. And you can say the same again in India, even if you just compare the two traditions embodied in the Mahabharata on the one hand and the Ramayana on the other. If you look at the character of Krishna, you have a much more, playful and light-hearted character. If you look at Rama, then, you've got a much more serious fellow who has his wife march across burning coals to prove her fidelity, never thinking for a minute that she might ask him to do the same. All these traditions have these different elements, and
there is. So you're saying, in some sense, in fact, perhaps it's the very diversity you think will always exist in the world is giving you some sort of hope that the authoritarians can never tie everything down.
They will never do that. I think the worry, though, still is that they might do an enormous amount of damage. And I think this is particularly a worry in the modern world, in a way that I think it wasn't in the ancient. Partly because the capacity of states, political authorities to control the ordinary population was very limited. I mean, the Roman emperors could act pretty viciously and harshly on the Roman elites, but much, much less so on the everyday population, except to the extent to which they could tax and extract, benefit and so on from them. But now we live in a world in which, every state can pinpoint your position, both geographically if they want to, but also in terms of your social life to a very high degree of precision, which gives them a much greater power coming from their capacity for surveillance. And, they don't need to find tax farmers to get some money off you. It all goes out of your pay packet, whether you like it or not.
Yes.
That's
Does this mean?
World, I think.
Yes, I take your point. And it is alarming. I think it is alarming. As we draw this discussion to an end, can I ask you, does this mean that in fact liberalism needs more champions? That there's a way in which liberals tend, on the whole, to be fairly relaxed about freedom, and I wonder whether both in the West, where there are some challenges from what's loosely called identity politics, we can't open that door today, but in the world itself, it's so very much contested. Does it need more champions? Do we need to take it less for granted and stand up for it?
I think so. That's essentially what I do in my professional life. That's what I see myself as concerned with, being an advocate for this way of thinking, but not so much by trying to simply be an advocate of already existing ideas, but more by thinking about the nature of the ideas, the applicability to the new world, and how they might need to be restated for a modern audience, restated in a way that addresses the nature of the modern world. So that's what I see myself as doing. But there are lots of other ways of doing it. I think CIS has been, to my mind, one of the great champions of liberalism in Australia, since Greg Lindsay founded it back in, I think, 1976. And I've always been very happy to be a contributor to that exercise.
Well, that's very kind of you, and I thank you very much for your time, valuable as it is, and for your insights. It's been very helpful indeed. I've been speaking with Chandran Kukathas, who's the Lee Kong Chang Chair in Political Science and Dean of Students in Social Science at the Singapore Management University, and we've been speaking together on the questions around liberalism. This has been another podcast from the Centre for Independent Studies. For decades, the CIS has been an independent voice working to deliver evidence-based policy within a classical liberal framework. We rely solely on the generosity of people like you for donations to advance our cause. Head to cis.org.au to see how you can get involved. I'm Rob Forsyth. Thank you for listening.